The federal deficit exploded last month despite tariff revenue flooding in as Congress's freight train speeds us straight off the cliff. First, the good news, tariff revenue is now coming in at $250 billion annualized, which in theory creates room for income tax cuts that are far more helpful than tariffs. But then the very bad news, last month the federal government spent $630 billion, which is $7.5 trillion annualized. That's nearly 10% up in a year, and notably the economy did not grow 10% last year, so the American people lost ground. This put the federal government in deficit for an annualized $3.5 trillion. Moreover, that deficit is up 20% last year. We definitely didn't grow 20% last year. In fact, it was the first July outside of the COVID spending orgy in 2020. Now, this is all pretty weird considering small government Republicans have total control of Washington plus Doge's big balls. So what's driving it? In raw numbers, year-to-date spending is up $397 billion over last year. About a fifth of that is added interest on the national debt, which is now the second biggest category after Social Security, as in we are borrowing the interest payments. Of the remaining $319, fully 92% was mandatory programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Outside these, it was just a tiny little $16 billion spending bump, about 0.5%. Made of $43 billion more on military and border, and an actual cut of $17 billion in non-defense discretionary, meaning everything from U.S. aid to CDC to the Department of Education. So while media loves pinning worst deficit ever on Trump, roughly 96% of the spending came either from legacy debt or from social programs Congress puts on autopilot so they don't have to actually vote for 96% of spending increases. So what's next? Brought to you by I Trust Capital. While Congress could have cut more, the core problem is the social programs on autopilot. Republicans did throw a couple cuts into Big Beautiful on Medicaid for able-bodied and student loans, but current estimates say we've got somewhere between 100 and 200 trillion in hidden debt on those social programs, so-called unfunded liabilities, on top of the annual $250 billion spending boosts. That would take national debt close to $250 quadrillion, which is just shy of a gazillion. For perspective, 250 trillion of debt is literally more than the entire net worth of the American people. So yes, the federal government literally owes everything we own. The problem, of course, is cutting Social Security and Medicare is how you lose elections. Grandma eating cat food headlines write themselves, meaning the only way to fix it is rammed through a balanced budget amendment that sets off a gladiator battle where you can't invade Afghanistan, rebuild Ukraine, or gender swap illegals because Social Security needs the money. Unfortunately, there is no appetite in Washington for a balanced budget that clips their own wings, meaning the most likely is we autopilot straight off the cliff, at which point investors stop buying treasuries, interest rate soars, and the Fed parachutes in to replace the buyers, bringing us to the end game of a central bank literally printing the annual budget, which could go Japan, 30 years of recession, or it could go Argentina, where anybody who doesn't have gold or Bitcoin is eating the cat food. The new podcast just dropped, rounding up all last week's videos in 20 minutes. Search Peter St. Onge wherever you enjoy your podcasts. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.